Hey, this is AEE bringing you the latest episode of The Accelerator. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the latest in education news.
Hello again, my name is Chris and welcome back to another episode of The Accelerator. Today we have Vernon joining us. Vernon's going to be speaking on imposter syndrome and leadership. Vernon, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Please, for the people at home, tell us about yourself, what you do, who you are.
All right. So my name is Vernon David. For many years, I've been in the education system. I used to be the principal at Redwood College for about 10 years or so. Then I moved on to be the executive head at Crawford International North Coast. I spent the last 5 years there, and I've started my own company called Eagles Leadership Institute, where we do a lot of training and development and coaching, both of leaders, middle managers, and just do a lot of CETA accredited training as well. So that's where
awesome.
We are right now. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. That's incredible. Yeah. Sure. Vernon, we're going to talk a bit on imposter syndrome and leadership today, but before we get to leadership and the whole concept of leading, tell us a bit about imposter syndrome. What is that?
Well, it's something we don't talk often about, but over the years, whether it's me mentoring Christian leaders or principals, deputies, we did a lot of that over the last 15 years or so. The thing that I've noticed is there's this imposter syndrome that a lot of leaders deal with. Probably over 70% of leaders will at some point or the other deal with imposter syndrome. And that really is, you sort of feel like a fraud in your position. You sort of feel like, am I really worthy? Do I really belong in this post? And it's something that we don't talk often about. We don't, leaders themselves are too scared to articulate this to people, lest people see them in a lesser way. You know? And so it's something that you sort of suffer through. And yet, we know that the majority of leaders will actually go through this at some point in their life or the other.
Sure. It sounds like dealing with that can be quite a scary thing to go through. What is your personal experience with imposter syndrome, either going through it or dealing with people who have gone through it?
I think, depending again on your context and where you grew up, I think in South Africa, when I talk to our South African audience, especially if you're a person of color, people don't realize what apartheid has done to a person of color in South Africa. And apartheid's finished a long time ago. But that whole idea of white is right, this whole idea of, hey, do I really belong here? Or often I would have black parents come to me and say, hey, I want a white teacher. Because we have this idea of what color is, and what white is. And then when you're a person of color coming into the space, often you have to ask yourself, do I actually belong there? Because of all the other things that have been around you and shaped you. And again, this is not something that only people of color go through. People that are white and Europeans and Americans and all of that, they all go through this at some point or the other. But just contextually, it does cause a problem, especially amongst people of color, even in South Africa. And often what happens is you ask yourself, do I actually belong in this room? Am I here because of the color of my skin, or am I here because I actually have the talent to do the job that I'm hired to do? And so whether you're in the South African rugby team and you think, am I a quota, or do I actually have the talent? And that's just exacerbated the whole imposter syndrome. And it's something that we don't really talk about a lot in our country. And so I've seen it in my coaching of leaders. I've felt it even as a leader when I started off as a principal. Do I actually belong here? Can I actually lead this group of people, and do I have the talent to do so? And it's these things that you keep on trying to perform because you have this deep insecurity about your own talents and your gifts. And so it's something that I think it's good to talk about and for us to be real with one another, to say, how can we overcome this? Because at some point in your life, you will deal with it. And the crazy part is, some of the greatest leaders and people who have produced the most exceptional work
Mm.
have gone through this.
Sure, you don't often expect that, especially from those who have achieved such great things. It's interesting to hear you speak on it in a South African context, because even on its own, imposter syndrome is not something we often think about or look for, but especially so because of it happening in a South African context. So it's interesting that you touch on that.
Yeah.
How do we, as individuals, go about identifying imposter syndrome in others and potentially in ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're not psychologists, right? But the thing is, when I talk to leaders, and it's amazing because it's the ones that have done exceptionally well. They are the ones that battle with this. When you're a novice and you don't really know your job well enough, you think you know everything, right?
Yes, yes.
But as you grow into it, you realize, hey, there's a lot of things I don't know. And when you talk to people of high caliber who've achieved a lot, you'll find out that they realize how little they actually know. And so often you sit down with heads of schools or leaders or corporates, and as much as they've achieved so much, they feel like a fraud because they feel like, I don't deserve this. I feel like at some point somebody's going to open the door and say, hey, you actually, you shouldn't be in that chair.
Yes.
And that feeling is that feeling that most leaders don't want to articulate. Especially they're scared to say it lest they be judged. And I think that's something that we should be able to unpack and provide a safe community and environment for people to actually say, hey, I'm dealing with it. What can I do to overcome that?
It's interesting to think that, we look at all these really intelligent and incredible people around us who've achieved so many things, and that they could be going through this and we wouldn't even know about it. But if I'm a leader and I am going through this imposter syndrome, and I think, do I deserve to be here? Am I worthy to sit in the seat?
I just got lucky.
I just got lucky.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
How does that now affect me as a leader? What sort of outcome can we see that having? What impact can we see that having on me as a leader if I'm going through that?
One of the things that, in my experience, and I'll talk about what I've seen and heard and observed, is that you keep on feeling you've got to prove yourself, right? And so when a leader feels that imposter syndrome, it feels like, am I a fraud? Do I really belong? There's so much of energy that it takes up in you trying to continuously prove yourself, to prove that you're not incompetent, to prove that you're the hardest worker in the room, to prove that you deserve to be there, right? And when you waste that energy trying to prove yourself, you really never step into your God-given destiny in being who He created you to be. And so what we find is a lot of those leaders spend too much of time trying to prove themselves than actually being creative, innovative, and moving forward and taking their organization, their businesses to the next level. So the enemy has a way of distracting you.
So they just spend so much effort in putting in more and more and more because they feel they need to do so.
Correct.
And they find themselves distracted. They drain of energy. They find themselves distracted from their responsibilities and who they're meant to be and the purpose they're meant to achieve.
Exactly. And that's so important as a leader, because as a leader you're focusing on your business, you're focusing on the organization, and see how you're going to take it forward. And if I had to be honest, there are times where I would go to bed just drained out of my mind, and all I've been doing is putting out fires and showing everybody, hey, I belong. Instead of saying, hey, wait a moment, how am I going to spend my time and energy on how I can move the organization forward? And so I think it's very important for us to understand as leaders, the more energy you place on a specific thing, the more that's going to move.
Okay.
Right? But if you're performing all the time, here's the deal about performing is you're going to stay on that same stage the whole time.
There you go. So I think the next big question is, now that we have a better understanding of imposter syndrome and what it can mean for the individual, and as you said, we're not psychologists.
Yeah.
We can't snap our
Correct.
fingers and cure somebody. But how do we, as the individual going through imposter syndrome and those standing on the side, how do we now overcome this imposter syndrome?
Sure. I mean, we're not going to do it on one podcast, right? But, one of the things, again, in my observation is that people are dealing with this. They don't like to take credit for their good work. We spoke about, I just got lucky. It's not really me. And yeah, we got to be humble, but not false humility, right? If you've done a great job, you should be able to acknowledge it. And all credit goes to the Lord, okay? However, we need to be able to say, hey, yeah, I think I did a good job, and there's nothing wrong with that,
Absolutely.
because it is, God's given you the grace to do it, and you've done it. Tick it off, and then you move on, but don't belittle yourself in front of others. Don't, what can I say, minimize the efforts you've put in something. And those are important. And I think especially in our Christian world, we're so cautious of being overconfident, where we come out as arrogant and display hubris, right? Which we don't ever want to do. But what we also need to recognize is when people applaud you for what you've done, to be able to genuinely receive it. Because if you're unable to receive the acknowledgements of others, that's also pride. But it masks itself as false humility. So I think we need to be careful of that. And some of the things that we can look at in dealing with imposter syndrome, is perfectionism is not a good thing, right? And when you find yourself caught up in perfectionism, because it's going to always delay you from actually doing what you need to do, because you want to get it just right. And I think we got to be careful of that. It also gets us to, perfectionism gives us an opportunity to be over self-critical. And we're able to justify it because we go, we're a perfectionist. Well, you got to stop that, right? Because that's not, we want you to walk in excellence as a leader, but perfectionism is going to stall you from reaching your true potential. So what we've got to do is be able to say, hey, hold on. Nothing is perfect, but we're going to walk in excellence, and we serve a God of excellence.
Yes.
And what we're not going to do is we're not going to be self-critical and overly self-critical. We are not going to allow the fear of failure to anesthetize us into where we are. We are not going to get ourselves to compare my leadership to somebody else's.
Yes.
That comparison, and how am I achieving and how that person's achieving. We're not going to do that, right? Because I'm not going to look at another leader and compare myself to them because they're not in my context.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to say, what is it that I need to do? What are my KPIs, or what are my goals, and what do I need to achieve? Am I achieving that? Because that's going to really help me stop pretending to be something else and somebody else, and actually get down and get my hands dirty and get the job done. And not allow myself to feel like a fraud.
Yes.
If that answers your question.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you speak about, it almost sounds like a spectrum when you speak about dealing with this imposter syndrome. On one hand, as you said, if somebody compliments you, you don't want to fall into the trap of, no, it wasn't me, no big deal, that sort of thing. You need to be able to humbly accept that. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you don't want to be a perfectionist. You don't, because then it gets into your head and things get delayed and that sort of thing. So it sounds like as leaders, it's really important to find that balance between both ends of that spectrum. Yeah,
I think, and where the imposter syndrome comes in, it because it makes you feel like a fraud, right? You got to keep on trying to prove yourself to everybody around you, and that unfortunately gets you moving on either side of that spectrum and not really being balanced, recognizing that, wait a minute, when I do a good job, I'll be applauded, I receive that, and then I move on. So I think it's important. And then what else it does is it speaks into that self-doubt in our lives. As a leader, you're going to have self-doubt. There's no two ways about it. I mean, when Joshua is about to take over the mantle, God comes to him and repeatedly tells him, be strong and courageous.
Yes,
be strong and courageous. And often when you're following a strong leader and you got to take over from him, Be strong and courageous, because you will have doubt. Faith is not the absence of doubt. You know, we got to understand that.
Absolutely.
Because of doubt, I need faith. You know, so if I had no doubt, faith is not necessary.
Absolutely.
So we need to understand, you know, that sometimes the environment can create and instill in us this imposter syndrome, where we feel that we've got to continuously prove ourselves to everybody. And then at the same time, what we've got to realize is we are not going to dance for someone else's tune.
There we go.
All right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do want to touch on leadership in general, but before we move on to that, I want to just touch on how, as a leader, especially as Christian leaders, how as a Christian leader could I create an environment for myself that ensures that I am kept away from mindsets and processes that allow me to fall into that imposter syndrome space.
I think as a leader, you've really got to be self-aware. You know, self-awareness, also in recognizing the presence of an imposter syndrome, is probably the first step of overcoming it, right? It's just hey, wait a moment, I think I could fall into that trap. So immediately the fact that I know that this can happen helps me immensely, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing as a leader. And then the next thing is I've got to learn to reframe my negative thoughts about me. You know, the ability to reframe it is very important for a leader. You know, the ability to say, okay, I'm feeling this. What does that mean? You know, so you challenge, reframe the negative self-talk about you. And then at the same time, you find, you know, often if you've grow up in a home where you've got very critical parents, you then deal with those issues right through your life.
Yes.
You know, and so being able to reframe the negative thoughts, be able to set realistic goals for yourself as a leader, you know, celebrate your achievements.
There we go.
You know, it's important. And then I think seek support. For myself, you know, I've never been scared to go to people I value in their leadership and experiences and ask them for help, you know. So for me, and I appreciate that. You know, I mean, even over the last 5 years, whether I was at Crawford, you know, I'd every now and then give Graham a call and say, hey, listen, let's have coffee. And I say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? You know, having people in your life where you can just talk to, and leaders have been there already. So having people that you've established trust relationship with, who can communicate with you, maybe sometimes unpleasant truth, nevertheless,
yes,
who care deeply about you to see you succeed. Having that type is very, very important for the leader. So because an imposter, and a person who's dealing with an imposter syndrome, does not want to ask for help lest he be found out.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it keeps you locked in. But what we know about leadership is, and being a leader is, you got to be around other leaders. You have no choice in the matter. You got to seek them out. You got to go find them, and trust the Lord that in your ability to develop strong relationships with them, that you can then have the privilege of being vulnerable. You know, and in that there's so much of growth that's available for you.
Sure, that's absolutely incredible. It's a real eye opener to have you talk about leadership in the context of relationships and being vulnerable. And I think so often as leaders, it can be easy to fall into the trap of, I'm at the top, I need to be tough, I need to be a stone wall, nothing needs to knock me down, like I carry the load by myself. But having those relationships is so vital in order to be able to not only collaborate on things of leadership, but just to have that support when you need it.
Yeah, you know, the thing is, for years, you know, we've had a lot of transactional leaders who've done exceptionally well. They've built amazing companies. They've built amazing teams, and have acquired great wealth in doing so. But what I've noticed in my observation is that transactional leadership alone does not cut it anymore because the world has changed. And so we got to see our leaders move from just being transactional leadership. And transactional leader is a guy that says, you get paid, do your job.
Sure.
It takes the whip out and whoops you until the job's done.
Yes.
Right? And when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a transactional leader will take you to right up to the third level, right, of belonging. And go, yeah, we're all good, and we'll give you a little card on your birthday and make you feel good. But the problem is a lot of businesses and organizations still find a huge turnover in staff. Why? Because the transactional leader does not keep you inspired enough to keep you in that organization.
Yes.
And so all over the world, people are going, how do we build capacity within our leaders to move them just from being a transactional leader to be a transformational leader? And how do I get you to a place where I build you, I inspire you, and I grow you to a point where you feel I belong here. This is where I want to be, and this is where I want my potential to show, and shine.
Yes.
So that is part of our growth as leaders. And I think as the world is changing at such a rapid rate, we've got to fundamentally see the shift in our leadership models around the world, right? And see how we can get people to make that shift. Now, if you're dealing with an imposter syndrome, you're going to get stuck in a space and you're not going to allow yourself the space to take that leap of faith and transform and actually become a better leader. If that makes sense to you.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. Yeah, sure. It all sounds a bit daunting, all laid out in front of you like that, for sure. But I think you've made some excellent points about sort of leadership and opening oneself to those sort of opportunities. And I think that's a great segue to hop into the concept of leadership itself. And I want to open the floor up to you here because I know that's something you've got experience in talking on. What is your experience with leadership and being involved in leadership roles, and how have you, as a leader or being involved with leaders, what have you seen that's made you gone, wow, that's an excellent example of leadership?
Sure. I've led schools for many years, led church for many years and organizations. And I've been a student of leadership long before I even started being a leader. Leaders come in all shapes and sizes. There's no one size fits all, and that's why there's millions of books written on leadership. But the world as we know it is changing in such a rapid rate that it requires a different kind and type of leader. We spoke earlier about transformational leadership, right?
Yes.
And how that helps us inspire the next generation of employee, the next, the millennials are giving leaders a hard time, right? Because they don't fit the mold of what you got taught at university.
Absolutely.
So what we find is leaders who have a growth mindset to recognize that they've got to keep on evolving and growing, adapting and changing. The fact that it's not a one size fits all, and what you've done in the past may not necessarily get you to be successful in the future. It's sort of like when the Lord speaks to Moses. The first time he goes to the rock, he's got to strike the rock and water comes out.
Yes.
But the next time, he's got to speak to the rock. But what Moses does is he gets so caught up with a successful idea and plan, he goes and strikes the rock again. And that costs him from entering into the promised land, And why I'm using that example is because leaders have got to evolve. We got to understand the times. And there might be things, good leaders are able to evolve to a point where the things that they may not have liked to do, but see the necessity to do it and do it. Because whether we like it or not, our employees have changed.
Absolutely, for sure.
And there's a huge gap right now in training managers and leaders around the world, actually, on how do we work with the millennials right now. And these millennials are growing in all our organizations, and eventually they're soon to become probably leaders and middle managers and whatever it is.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
how do we manage that? And I think a leader that exercises a growth mindset, someone that is able to lead with empathy and kindness, one who recognizes that the successes of the past become the obstacles of the future, and who's able to evolve with the times, but who's firm on his character and his values. That doesn't change,
There it
And I
is.
think those are successful leaders. And so when I look around the world, there is a huge void in leadership, because when you look at the political landscape, we look at everything around us, it seems like we've got a lot of leaders that just are very fluid, and we just agree with the times. And for me, when I look at a guy like, let's say, Nelson Mandela, who understood what forgiveness was and was able to forgive, that's after 27 years being in prison, right? That's a deep sense of leadership that we could look and go, wow, that's something else. There's no perfect leader, but we've got to understand the context we're living in and how do we serve the people we're serving. And to me, the greatest of the leaders are going to be those who understand what servant leadership's about.
There we go. So how do I now, as a leader, we've spoken about how we can develop ourselves into being a better leader, a great leader, but as you said, there's no such thing as a perfect leader, and sometimes things go awry. How do I, as a leader, deal with failure and use failure as an opportunity to grow?
The first thing is we got to reshape our minds and our paradigm when it comes to failure, right? And if I start to look at failures as gifts, it changes everything, right? Because I, as a child of God, my life is in His hands.
Absolutely.
And there's certain things that I would do that He might not be happy with, and there's certain things that I do that He's happy with, right? So, but when I've made a mistake, right, and I dropped the ball, I need to understand that my God has the ability to take my failures and turn it around, right? And when we study business and when we study inventions and we study some of the most creative things that's happened on the face of the earth, has been done because of somebody failing, not because they got it right. And there's so many stories about how a failure becomes a massive success. And a typical example, I think, is it 3M, the company that does the Post-its?
Yes.
I mean, the story goes, the scientists were trying to find a glue that was very, very strong. But all they could do was come up with a slight adhesive, and it wouldn't work. And eventually, years later, they needed a slight adhesive.
And then they had it ready to go.
Absolutely. So failures are gifts. Failures are gifts. And it's there to grow you. The only time a failure is a failure is if you have learned nothing from it.
Sure.
Otherwise, it's a gift. And every leader will have failures. But change your mindset where you go, wow, okay, I failed, but what have I learned from it? And if you've learned from it, even though it shouldn't have happened, right? You could have messed up or whatever it is. As long as you learn from it, that now becomes a gift for you to move forward, right? You don't have to be a perfectionist. No leader is expected to get it right all the time. Just that we must understand as a leader, when we get it wrong, it impacts people around us. If I make a bad decision, I've got to retrench staff. If I make a bad decision, my staff get hurt. The people around me get hurt. So the weight of my decision making is something that I've got to take very, very seriously. And the best way to do it is to have good people around you, because it's in the counsel of many there's wisdom.
Absolutely. A failure is only a failure if you've learned nothing from it. I absolutely love that. I think, even just beyond leaders, I think that's something really profound we should all take to heart. Before we finish things off, to flip what we've just spoken about on its head, how do I, as a leader, measure my success and ensure that I am continuously sticking to those measurements?
Sure. Okay. There's a short answer and there's a long answer. Man. So, when you're a leader in a corporate space, you've got your KPIs, and your success is measured on achieving your KPIs. Very simple. It's very clean. There's no subjectivity there.
Right.
Boom, 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 boom. Right? As a child of God, when you're a leader, it goes beyond just achieving your KPIs. It has to be. Because God doesn't put you in a position of leadership to grow your EBIT, grow your numbers, have a good
Absolutely.
budget and get your bonuses, You've called to extend the kingdom of God and advance it further than it's been in that space you're in. And so growing up as a young man in leadership, I always thought if I meet my KPIs, if I've done whatever I'm supposed to do, whatever my responsibility says on my contract, then I've achieved success. If you have all the money in the world, you've got all the go on holidays and do whatever you wanted, that's success. But that isn't success. It's part of it, but it isn't all of it. Doing what God's called you to do on the earth and seeing that being done wherever you find yourself in is far more important than you could ever imagine. What does that look like? As a head of a school, you could say, well, I've got my staff to do exceptionally well. They produce results in the class. But what else? Have you actually showed them kindness? Have you shown them love? Have you shown them the Father in how you relate to them? Because that's what it's about. Have you really spent time with them to inspire them so that they can be the very best versions of themselves? Yeah, because that's not on your KPI. But you're a leader. And if God's put you there, that's what you're supposed to do. It goes beyond just ticking the boxes. Because you've got to answer to a earthly master. But one day you're going to have to answer to a heavenly Father.
Exactly.
And when you're able to bring heaven to wherever you find yourself, and I'm not talking just about Christian organizations and schools, but I'm talking about everywhere, because you can do that, right?
Absolutely.
When you're able to do that and inspire people to be the very best versions of themselves, where they see Jesus in you, and they don't even believe in Jesus, and they go, sure, tell me more, then you know what? Then you are succeeding as a leader. Because it just can't be about the KPIs and making sure that I tick all the boxes. It's
1,000 new customers this month or whatever it is.
God's called you for more than that. God's called you for more than that, because here's the deal, right? If you don't get the 1,000 customers, they'll hire somebody else to get it. But you are there to get the 1,000 customers and more. Because our job, really, my part, right, is being 10 times better than the rest. And being 10 times better than the rest is not just achieving what you tell me to do, but doing a whole bunch more. And that, to me, really, at the heart of it, Jesus himself said it best. When you see me, you see the Father. He kept on saying that all the time. He would do all these amazing miracles, but the thing that gave him the greatest joy was saying, you see me, you see the Father.
Sure.
And I think as a Christian leader, that's the thing that we should aim for the most. Because ultimately, that's what matters, right?
Sure. You're absolutely right. I think it's so easy to just fall into the trap of, I'm a good leader because I've achieved all my KPIs. But as you so correctly say, there's so much more to being a leader. You're in that space because there was a plan for you to be in that space.
Correct.
And then to achieve what was set out for you within that space is probably the highest form of leadership measurement.
Absolutely, because there's two parts of you. The one part is I'm sitting here and I've got a job to do and I've got to do my job. The other part of me is that I'm seated in heavenly places. And that tells me if I'm seated in heavenly places with Christ Jesus, I've also got a heavenly mandate, right? And for us, the heavenly mandate that we have here is advancing the kingdom of God on the earth.
Absolutely.
No matter where you are. Right? This is not a Sunday church thing. This is an everyday thing. Because when you do that, everything about you changes. You really do. And you start to value things you would have not thought valuable. You know, I'm a pastor's son as well, right? And when I was a young man, I would look at my dad in my teens and my early 20s and think, sure, man, why does he do these things? Why does he allow these people to do this? And why does, people would talk bad about him and people would say all kinds of things and he just loved him. And I thought at that point in my life, that was just sheer weakness. And as I grew older and became a dad, I realized how strong it is in the face of adversity, in the face of betrayal, and all of that is to love uninhibited, to love without strings attached. No transaction, just completely do it. And I found that is probably one of the greatest strengths my dad has and we can have as leaders, and I think just to encourage every leader. Sometimes your staff might turn against you. Sometimes the people around you might turn against you. Sometimes the people that you love the most can just betray you. And you must go through that. You must go through it. Why I'm saying this? Because Jesus has been through it all. And we want to be just like him. And all of that is part of God busy purifying you. Let the hay and the stubble burn and all the precious jewels be what it really is. And it will last the furnace and the fire. And so I think we all go through that. So, I want to encourage the leaders. It's never easy. It's a lonely, lonely space. But here's the deal. He said he'll never leave us nor forsake us, right? So it might just be you and him. But even in those moments, God's drawing you to himself. And I think one of the things that we got to do is ask the Lord to provide us with godly men and women around us. And I think that's important. I think even as a company at AEE, I think you'll have amazing human beings here. And having the ability to provide an association of leaders that can actually encourage one another. And you don't forsake that gathering, because it is important to be a relevant leader on the earth. You got to realize very quickly we need each other.
Sure, that's found myself at a bit of a loss for words. That's quite profound. I think what you said is something that even beyond leadership is something that really we can all take to heart. And I think that's such an awesome message to leave the leaders watching this with. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. You've shared some really insightful things, and we really, really appreciate you coming on.
Well, so thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been good to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of The Accelerator. If you want to see more, like, subscribe, stay tuned. We've got more on the way.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you love what you've heard, make sure to like, follow, share, and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube to get the latest scoop on everything education.